Good morning, and on behalf of DeHavilland EU, welcome to this morning's discussion on how Europe's decarbonisation agenda will impact European skies. My name is George Reed, and I'm the DeHavilland lead on EU aviation policy, as well as Europe's wider path towards decarbonisation. This morning, we'll be hearing from an expert panel working across global and European aviation policy. And this morning's discussion will seek to explore three key themes regarding the future sustainability of aviation. Firstly, we're going to examine the impact of COVID-19 and the aviation sector capacity to decarbonise. Secondly, we're going to be examining the methods, technologies, and regulation which can encourage decarbonisation. And thirdly, we're going to be discussing the future of aviation and the sector and wider mobility policy in the future. But why are we having this discussion now? Well, it's clear we're at a pivotal time in the discussion about sustainable aviation. Only yesterday, 24 European aviation stakeholders from across all areas of the value chain called for an EU Pact for sustainable aviation by the end of 2021 as part of the sector's recovery from COVID-19. But also the European Commission is about to reveal its new approach to sustainable aviation fuels, we think in February 2021. Europe is also looking towards a new sustainable and smart mobility strategy to be published on December the 9th, not to mention issues like Brexit and of course revisions to the Single European Sky initiative. So to discuss this and other issues surrounding the future of sustainable aviation, I'd like to introduce our panelists this morning. In terms of structure, each panelist will give a 5-minute opening statement before we turn to some questions from me and you, the audience. Now, Marian-Marinescu is running slightly late this morning, so we're going to have a slightly updated order, but I'll introduce him nonetheless. So Marian-Marinescu has been a member of the European Parliament since 2007 and Romania's accession to the European Union. An aviation engineer, Mr. Marinescu worked for more than 20 years in aircraft design and manufacturing and has been a leading voice on the TRAN committee. He has led on the development and implementation of crucial files, such as the Single European Sky, and is chair of the European Parliament Sky and Space Intergroup from 2019 up to 2024 in this legislature. In 2017, Mr. Marinescu received the European Business Aviation Award. Next up, we're really pleased to have Martina De Palma from the European Regions Airline Association. Martina is the Sustainability Manager for ERA, where she represents members on environmental issues ranging across the aviation value chain. Martina has worked closely on influential reports, such as ERA's Green and Sustainable Connectivity Report. But before joining ERA, Martina worked in the Environment Unit at Eurocontrol, at the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, and in the Aviation Policy Unit of the European Commission, focusing on environmental and social files. And finally, we have Michael Gill. Michael Gill is the Executive Director of the Air Transport Action Group, ATAG. He was appointed as the Director of Aviation Environment at the International Air Transport Association, referred to as IATA, in November 2013, where he's responsible for developing and implementing IATA's work in the environmental field, particularly in the areas of climate change, noise, biofuel commercialization, and the IATA Environmental Assessment Program. Now, ATAG play a unique role in global aviation as the only global industry-wide body to bring together all industry players so that they can speak with one voice. Good morning, everyone.
Morning, George. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So just a couple of pieces of input in terms of housekeeping and questions. So we would love to hear your questions for our panel. So for those of you watching at home, if you'd like to ask a question, please just type it into the chat box and I'll ask that to the panelists. And of course, today's discussion will be uploaded onto YouTube and also DeHavilland EU social media shortly after we finish. But we're going to start off with Martina to give her opening remarks, and then we'll move on to Michael after that, and hopefully we can get on to Marian. But without further ado, Martina.
Good morning.
Oh,
I'm here from the very beginning. But, I know.
Oh, well, that's the magic of Zoom calls. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marian. Marian, we've just introduced you, so thank you very much for joining us. I think we'll keep to the original order then. Marian, do you want to kick us off with your 5-minute opening remarks?
Yes. It's this is the period when we learn to use a lot of softwares. Even Zoom has a lot of variants. But I was here from the very beginning. So good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. And as you said, it's a very important period. We are speaking a lot about decarbonization of aviation and in the same time recovery from the crisis. And there are different position papers issued by the different entities. The last one, as you said, it was yesterday. We in EPP group, we elaborated also a position paper for transport in general, for transport for 2030 and beyond. And we are speaking, of course, about aviation. So transport, as you have seen, it's a star in the impact study of the Commission. That it's an impact study not to find out if we can reduce 55% of emission till 2030, but it's an impact study to bring arguments that is good 55. In my opinion, it's not a very professional impact study, and the transport is the star. They are speaking about buildings and transport, and the only measure that Commission is speaking about, because you said that we shall speak about different measures to decarbonize the transport. So the only measure proposed by the Commission there is the ETS. And of course, they are speaking also about alternative fuels. So we are speaking also in our position paper about this alternative fuels. We are not speaking about ETS. We are insisting a lot in the technical measures that we can take to really reduce the emissions. So alternative fuel is the first one. Then I think that for aviation, it would be very good to apply the results of the research from Clean Sky, where there are very good results, especially for engines. But for this, we need a program, European program for renew the fleet, because it's not possible for airlines to do this alone. So should be a program of replace the old aircraft with new aircraft that are better prepared for reducing emissions. Then we are waiting for the new technologies. You have seen Airbus spoke something about hydrogen and also electric engines, electric propulsion, or hybrid, of course. And for this, we are asking in our position paper for developing the regional airports, which means to change, to replace the state aid rule, which is right now in place. So to make possible the subsidies from especially from the local authorities, in order to encourage the short flights between the regional airports, that these short flights could implement the electric technology. It's very easier for a small aircraft. You see the example of Norway. So it's easier for small aircraft to apply this technology. And I think that without a global agreement, it's not possible to survive in this period of transition. So we support a lot CORSIA, and we want to be faster applied. About recovery after the crisis, I don't see for the moment a lot of ways to solve. I think the best for EU, for Europe, would be to have an harmonized rule regarding the testing and I don't know, the measures that are taking to block the virus. This is for the moment, I think, the best solution, and it's asked for all the stakeholders, and I think that could be applied in order to improve the situation now, because anyway, this situation will take a lot of time. So we need a program of relief, recovery, and a resilience plan could have been very good for this. I table an amendment for this, introducing European projects, added value European projects. And one of these projects could have been aeronautics, to take the money from recovery plan and to help the industry. That's it for the moment. I think that I hope that will be questions to answer it. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Marian. That's a really interesting insight, particularly around some of the legislative work that you're doing in regard to that. And
yes, of course. You mentioned also Single European Sky. We started to work on it, and I hope that I propose a program with 14 December deadline for amendment. So I want to hurry up. Unfortunately, it came very late, middle of October in the Parliament.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it will be really interesting to hear industry's voice on this, and particularly in the context of yesterday's letter. And I think at this point, I'm going to hand over to Martina to discuss a little bit more about that and give her opening statement. So over to you, Martina.
Thank you, George, and thank you for having ERA in this panel discussion. The topic addressed is very relevant. And before I do address the topic, though, I would like to first introduce ERA to all of you and the current situation with the COVID-19. ERA is the European Airline Trade Association, represents 64 airlines. These airlines provide a niche service as they operate in the parts of Europe where aviation is both vital and many times the only mode of transport available. For example, if you consider the Canary Islands or also northern Norway. These airlines are crucial for promoting social and territorial equality, cohesion, and also they contribute to tourism, investment, and job creation. And like any other actor in the aviation ecosystem, ERA airlines have also been significantly impacted by the crisis. In fact, compared to September 2019, flights in September 2020 have been reduced by 43.6%, and city pairs have been reduced by 35.2%, which is quite significant in terms of connectivity. And also the latest forecasts are not looking very promising. If we look, for example, Eurocontrol's forecast, the latest figures say that we are at minus 62.5% in terms of air traffic compared to last year. However, despite the crisis, sustainability is still at the top of the sector's agenda. Of course, at the beginning of the crisis, the main focus was on the airline's survival, and it still is the focus, but it has been made clear by regulators and also by industry itself that sustainability is just as important and essential for the recovery of the sector. The efforts to decarbonize aviation sectors, therefore, have not stopped. They've actually accelerated if we consider, for example, any sort of policy development on aviation and environment, like the Refuel EU Aviation Initiative or the Sustainable Smart Mobility Strategy. Also, when it comes to the latest industry efforts, as George has mentioned earlier, yesterday, 24 associations of the European aviation ecosystem and travel and tourism, including ERA, have published a report on the aviation recovery. This report has been endorsed by airlines, airports, ANSPs, aeronautical manufacturers, trade unions, NGOs on environment and also on consumer action, service providers, business aviation, and the entire tourism sector. So this is quite a nice representation of the whole aviation and tourism ecosystem. And the report addresses different topics, including restoring public confidence, social and environmental sustainability, digitalization, competition, and resilience of the sector. And we have stressed here in this report the importance of a recovery that is fully compatible with the efforts to reduce the sector's environmental footprint. And this is, of course, only possible if the right policies are in place and that there is a balance between environment, social, and economic aspects. The sector has also called on EU leaders to join a EU Pact for Sustainable Aviation by the end of next year in 2021. This pact has both social and environmental aspects, which I will address later on in the panel discussion. But on the environmental side, the entire aviation ecosystem have announced a joint commitment to work with policymakers towards reducing CO2 emissions significantly by 2030, achieving net zero CO2 emission reductions by 2050, and also consider the possibility of making 2019 the peak year for CO2 emissions. But here I would like to stress the fact that this is only possible with common efforts from the industry and with the right policy framework in place. When it comes to how do we reach these goals, the industry has always had clear solutions. For example, last week, the EIB has published a draft EIB Climate Bank Roadmap, and it stated that there is no clear pathway for the sector to decarbonize. And I don't think this is the case because the sector has always had clear solutions to decarbonize, and these include technology, operational improvements, sustainable aviation fuel, market-based mechanisms. And the industry has enormous potential to reduce its impact on the climate and to contribute to the EU's climate ambitions. However, more investments in these solutions are needed in order for the industry to take a step closer to sustainable growth and carbon neutrality. And given that the solutions are still at the early stage of development or implementation, and also because the sector is currently under significant financial pressure due to the crisis, we need to ensure investments in these solutions. Hopefully, the sustainable and smart mobility strategy that is going to be released soon does take this into account and does address the long-term sustainability of the aviation sector, balancing between environment, social, and economic aspects. Therefore, the entire aviation ecosystem, the EU and member states need to come together to provide the necessary support and regulatory framework to enable the industry to achieve its environmental targets post-COVID-19. It's not possible to do this alone. Industry alone cannot achieve these targets. It is a very fragile moment for us, and we need the proper regulatory support, which will allow us to build back better and greener. So I'm quite excited to continue the discussion on this and hear any questions that the participants may have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martina. And has there ever been a more important time in terms of the relations between the sector and regulators? I think we'll move on to our next panelist, and we're really excited to have Michael Gill with us this morning. So, Michael, over to you.
George, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Really interesting to hear views from Marianne and from Martina, which somewhat chime with what I'm going to go over as well in my opening thoughts, perhaps under a slightly different lens. Three areas I really wanted to touch on just by way of introduction. Firstly, perception. Secondly, ambition. And thirdly, regulation. And just a few thoughts on each of those. Firstly, on perception. Despite the catastrophic situation the aviation industry finds itself in, and you heard that from Martina very clearly, we're seeing a drop in traffic that we have never seen before, had never imagined was going to happen. Despite that, the public scrutiny on aviation's climate impact simply hasn't gone away. Now, you know that anecdotally, you have it in all your conversations with a friend, with work contacts, that many people are alluding to the fact that one of the knock-on impacts of COVID is that we see clear skies, we see clean skies, and we see noise-free skies above our cities and towns. But it's also borne out through the media coverage, it's borne out through many of the passenger and consumer surveys. IATA did a survey just at the end of the summer, and in fact, in answer to the question, would you consider not flying in the future if you don't believe aviation's taking its climate responsibility seriously, the number of yes responses has actually gone up. post-COVID. So it's clear we have a perception challenge, and I don't think that's going to go away post-COVID. I think when traffic is able to come back to something close to normality, people are going to begin even more so asking themselves the question, can I really afford the environmental impact of this flight? Now, in terms of ambition, I think the answer to that question is very much yes. And the reason I say that is it's clear that we're an industry that's not shirked our environmental responsibility. We've recognized the CO2 impact that we have, the 2% of global man-made CO2 emissions that we're responsible for. You saw that ambition very clearly declared yesterday in the EU Pact that was signed by this very wide group of EU stakeholders. We've very rarely seen such a broad group of people, a group of organizations signing up to something like that. It's really encouraging. It's really rewarding. You've also seen it on a global level, and under the banner of our organization, ATAG, at the end of September, we released a report called Waypoint 2050. It plots the pathway for aviation to its existing global 2050 emissions reduction target. And it also looks at how, as a global sector, we could move to a net zero emissions future. Now, I think, again, for an industry like ours, and it's not just airlines, it's airports, it's air navigation service providers, it's manufacturers, for our industry to make these ambitious statements, to put in place these roadmaps at this particular time in its history, I think is absolutely remarkable, and it shows the level of ambition that we have. And finally, on regulation, and again, Martina alluded to this, not all regulation is bad. We're not against all regulation. Indeed, that's why we as an industry went to our international regulator, ICAO, back in 2009, 2010, and pushed for a global carbon offsetting regulation for the aviation sector. But we do have to be very careful, particularly at the current time, not to regulate in haste. So we've seen many discussions at a national level as to whether green conditions should be attached to the bailout packages given to the airline industry. We would say that at this current time, those kinds of proposals can have unintended consequences, and we have to be very careful about the regulation we put in place at such a delicate time for the sector. But it's also about the future of the emissions trading system. We have a global mechanism, CORSIA, and this may not make me popular in Brussels, but we would say with that global mechanism in place, there's no need for additional regulation for emissions on international aviation. Of course, domestic aviation is a very different question, but as far as international flights are concerned, we have the CORSIA mechanism. It was very hardly negotiated, a tough agreement to get to, but we need to maintain its integrity. And then on the issue of SAF mandates, I guess we'll come to that in a bit shortly. Again, we're not against SAF mandates per se, but they have to be accompanied by the right level of policy support in order to make them workable, and they have to have the right framework around them. So in essence, those are the three areas we as ATAG are looking at. It's about how we're perceived by the public generally and the flying public. It's about really driving the ambition across the sector towards these long-term objectives that we've set. And it's also keeping a careful eye on how regulation can impact on our sector, particularly at this very sensitive point in time.
Well, thank you very, very much, Michael. And I think we can certainly all conclude there's plenty of food for thought that are coming out of those introductory statements. And I would just say, if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat. We're now going to move on to our Q&A, and that's going to be based around sort of the three key sections: COVID-19, methods of decarbonisation, and aviation and wider transport. But Martina, let's kick off with you. You very clearly referenced the letter that was sent yesterday and the EU Sustainable Aviation Pact in what was actually a pretty unprecedented show of unity amongst stakeholders. I mean, what would you assess as the really key barriers between that EU Sustainable Aviation Pact turning from a piece of paper to reality by the end of 2021?
Well, there are significant challenges for this. Remember that it's 24 associations that have signed to this, and that we need public support and regulatory support to achieve these goals. These goals, because I don't think I've mentioned them earlier in too much detail, but the objectives of the Sustainability Pact are both social and environmental. And on the environmental side, we are proposing to reach significant CO2 emission reductions by 2030 in order to be in line with the EU climate action objectives. Then net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 from all flights within and departing from the EU. This means that by 2050, all emissions that are remaining from flights should be reduced as much as possible from the atmosphere, either via negative emissions that can be achieved through natural carbon sinks or dedicated technologies like CCS, carbon capture and storage. And then the final objective is considering the feasibility of making 2019 the peak year for CO2 emissions from European aviation. These objectives are quite significant and ambitious, especially as Michael said, in this very delicate moment for our sector. And these should be achieved various different actions. One being, for example, putting in place the right framework to promote sustainable aviation fuels. Particularly in the next 10 and 15 years, it is very important to accelerate this technology. And boosting the production and the uptake of SAF in Europe will be vital and should be a priority. And this can be done via public investment or support to the private investment in SAF production, and also support for the research and development of the new SAF feedstock and production pathways. So this is one of the key elements for the Sustainable Aviation Sustainability Pact. Another key action will be enabling fleet renewal and retirement. This could be done via a green stimulus for fleet renewal or a green incentive scheme. And then other actions, which are also quite relevant, consider also, for example, the continuation of the CES to improve ATM technology that will bring efficiency in the skies up to 10%. I think it was calculated, and also seeing how, for example, the European Investment Bank can make its policy relevant for the aviation sector and to invest in sustainable technologies. So I think these are the main elements. Of course, the details need to still be agreed upon. As mentioned, it's going to take place hopefully by the end of 2021. And we call on e-leaders to support the industry in this undertaking.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Martina. And a really interesting question has come through from Montserrat Barriga from ERA, the Director General of ERA, just around how the perception can be changed. So Marian, just in terms of how that perception can be changed from politicians, from the institutions around the necessary financial support for the sector. What can the sector do to get the EIB and the institutions on board to ensure that necessary financial support is there to make the green transition?
When you are speaking about money, always is very difficult. That's very clear. Perception should start from the reality that the transport is the basis of economy. And aviation, it's part of this, it's one of the transport modes. So we need aviation because otherwise the economy will suffer, as we can see right now very, very well. So that means that we have to invest because nothing can be improved without investment. Now, the problem is with the left side of the, let's say, political life that are even asking to reduce the flights and increase the prices and replace the short flights. For them, short means 2 hours with trains instead of 2 hours, 10 hours, and so on. So these are exaggerations that should be stopped because otherwise the economy will suffer a lot. So financing in this moment is possible from different parts of the budget of the MFF, but should be used in the right direction. Of course, it first is could be connecting Europe facility where the airports can take some money for modernization. There is the InvestEU where private money could be used. There is Horizon where it's very important to have a very clear research program. It's Clean Sky, which is important, CESAR, which is important. So these are the ways to do it. Perception for financing, I don't think that is very present. Now in this period, it's difficult to discuss about MFF, about budget. You have seen what happened yesterday. But for me, it's more difficult with the perception inside of the parliament that aviation is the very bad transport and should be not, okay, should reduce emission, but the best way to reduce emission is to stop the flights.
Thank you, Marianne. And Michael, you made reference to use of state aid and possible green strings attached to public money and possible unintended consequences of doing that. We've had a question in the chat section around that exact thing happening in the case of Air France. What are those perhaps unintended consequences that can arise from that? And can you see a permanent shift in the kind of power balance between state and the private aviation sector?
I think the problem is that in many situations, the requests for state aid and the need for these financial bailouts is absolutely urgent and vital. For many airlines, this is a question of survival. It's getting through it was getting through what was an extremely challenging summer, and it's getting through the extremely challenging winter season that the airlines have got ahead of them. And just the fact is, we've seen in the past, environmental regulation is extremely complex. There are technical aspects to it. There are very clear political aspects to it. In the European context, there are knock-on effects as far as relations within ICAO, as far as the negotiations within ICAO on a CORSIA or on a potential long-term goal for the sector agreed at a global level under ICAO. And the point I was making is that if you impose green conditions like emissions reduction targets, like noise reduction targets at airports, like obligations to not to fly short-haul flights when there is a rail alternative, without the necessary level of analysis, consultation, negotiation, you could find yourself imposing either a regulation which is impossible for the carrier to meet, or which in fact harms the particular airline's ability to recover from the current crisis. And I think the point I was making, and again would urge all stakeholders to consider, is when you get into the negotiations around bailout packages and the environmental conditions that may be attached, it has to be done in a coordination with the industry to make sure that you're not looking at anything, imposing anything that's inappropriate or that would have a difficult knock-on impact.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now, I think we've reached a really sort of interesting point in the discussion where perhaps we can move into more about the methodology of actually achieving sustainable aviation. So Martina, let's go over to you just in terms of the Energy Taxation Directive up for review next year in terms of the Commission's work programme. What can you see being the situation? What would be the ERA's perfect situation with regard to kerosene's inclusion? And can you see perhaps the pathway towards bilateral taxation if there's not able to be agreement in the Council in terms of the future of fuel taxation? apologies, Martina, I think you might be on mute. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so yeah, I was saying that ideally there is no energy taxation for airlines for the reasons that we all know. And curbing, usually taxation means that it would curb demand of aviation. And this is not ideal because this is not necessarily contributing to the decarbonization of the sector itself. It's just reducing flights, and people we have seen that want to fly. So that's not an ideal solution or measure to take into consideration, I think. Also, as Michael mentioned, there are unintended effects of such measures, and an extensive analysis is needed also when it comes, for example, to the impact on other modes of transport, for example, rail. If we do impose an energy tax on aviation, or if we do impose certain conditions that do curb demand and scrap domestic flights, for example, we might overwhelm the railway infrastructure, as they're not necessarily ready to hold the same capacity as the aviation industry can. So that's something to take into consideration before going on with certain policy measures. Also, this taxation can hurt really badly the economics of regional air connectivity, because it's already a fragile market, and further taxation will definitely hurt the market in regions where it is needed the most.
Marianne, possibly on that note, what's the appetite, do you think, among the Commission, but also relevant committees in the European Parliament around the revision of the Energy Taxation Directive, which will be a lot harder on kerosene? And is there a more sensitive approach that can be taken in the context of all of the economic difficulties that the sector are facing?
As I told you, unfortunately, the measures proposed by the Commission and by the part of the members of the Parliament are not intended to reduce really the emissions, but to decrease the level of flights. That's the reality. Okay, the tax on fuel, as it was already said, will increase the prices, and we shall see if it will increase also the number, will decrease the number of passengers, but anyway, will increase the cost of the airlines. So this is the reason. There is no other reasons. There is no other basis of this proposal. And they are saying that there is a lack of competition between railway and aviation, because railway has a tax on electricity, I think. I don't know what they are speaking about, and aviation not. So it's the same thing. But here I think that we have to say other thing. If we want to shift to rail from road or from aviation, for example, we have to have rail, because in this moment, in my opinion, the level of development of rail in EU is very low. That's very clear for everybody that is using this way of transport. International is very difficult because of the different national rules. There is no harmonization, there is no standardization. So first of all, they should speak about development of the rail in order to really shift the transport. I am waiting to see what Commission will propose, but I can tell you that I am waiting from Commission proposals in this direction, especially from Mr. Timmermans, that it's insisting a lot to this kind of measures. You have seen that even in agricultural, he threatened that he will withdraw the proposal of common agricultural policy, because the Parliament and the Council could arrive to a solution that is not convenient for you. It's not convenient, he is saying, for environment. So in this moment, there are a lot of exaggerations that that we should, I don't know, stop it. We have to think really how to achieve neutral, to be neutral in 2050.
Absolutely, and towards climate neutrality, not only across Europe but across the globe, one of the key methods taken globally is, of course, CORSIA, which came up in some of the opening statements. And I want to go over to Michael, because at the moment there's a public consultation in response to the Commission's roadmap for implementing CORSIA. They published that roadmap earlier this year. What's your take on CORSIA and the ETS being compatible? Is there a possibility for them to exist in harmony, or is that going to lead to an inevitability of double counting? How do you think the European Commission should approach the implementation of CORSIA, especially in light of COVID-19 and the revised baselines?
Let me start just by giving some perspective on the background to CORSIA. As I said earlier on, CORSIA was the subject of nearly 10 years of negotiation, discussion through 3 ICAO assemblies, to which the European member states participated. The final agreement that was adopted in 2016 is a political agreement. It's the result of concessions, compromises on a number of issues. And I think it's yet another example of the old adage that a good agreement is one that that all parties find perfect. So it's not the agreement that anybody would have drafted, neither industry nor governments, if they were been given a blank piece of paper. But it does achieve I think, a very solid balance and compromise between the interests of developed and developing states. And all of the European member states, indeed all of the ECAC member states, signed up to CORSIA and thereby committed to, on an international level, to a certain number of key principles. And the 2 key principles, I think, that need to be borne in mind are, firstly, that CORSIA was agreed to be the only global market-based measure for international aviation emissions, and that there shouldn't be double counting, paying twice for the same emissions. So that, to me, creates actually a very clear policy framework for the future of the ETS. With CORSIA in place, that obviates the need to have a regulation for emissions from international flights. Now, whether they're within the EU or whether they're from the EU to and from third countries. Now, that seems to me a very clear policy framework. What I would say is that what got us to the agreement in 2016, as I said, very intense and difficult negotiations. There is no question in my mind that the leadership that the EU had shown through those the early years of the 2010s was instrumental in bringing all parties to the table to try and come to an agreement on a global level, because it was recognized that we needed to go further, we needed to be more ambitious in our regulations. So I think the EU has to be congratulated for that. But when we look to the future, as I said, you have to remember, what's your overall objective here? It's environmental impact. It's reducing or mitigating CO2 emissions. And having airlines pay twice for the same emissions just doesn't achieve that. It only goes to make air travel more expensive for the carriers.
And Marian, what's your take on that? The chances of compatibility between the 2, ETS and CORSIA? Clearly, so much effort's gone into the building of ETS. So, what are your views on the matter? Marian, I think you might be on mute. Apologies.
As I mentioned already in the position paper that EPP agreed, we are speaking about CORSIA. We want to participate in CORSIA. The thing that we want to do is to make it faster, to work faster, because there are some delays there, some deadlines there that I think that could be changed to make it faster. It's true, there are very tough negotiations, but I think that the mood changed a little bit, so I think that we can succeed this. And ETS for aviation could be used for domestic flights, but for international flights we have to use CORSIA and to apply CORSIA. And in this way, we are keeping the competitivity of our airlines, because otherwise, if we are trying to apply only in Europe, these measures will harm a lot the competitivity. You know that the Commission was intending to, is intending still to come in February with a proposal for ETS to extend it to maritime, especially, and for roads. I don't know how they will do it, but in the same time to make modifications for ETS aviation in order to reduce the free allocations, which means that will create another problem on top of the crisis. So I hope that they will think twice before they will come with this proposal.
Absolutely, and Martina, Marian references the revision of the ETS and specifically around those free allowances. What's been the view of the ERA around this revision, and what do you want to see out of it in the context of the crisis?
Yeah, exactly. In the context of the crisis, expecting a swift phase out of the free allowances is just not something realistic. The free allowances allow the sector to gradually reduce their emissions, so they should be maintained in a slow, gradual phase out. That's the ideal outcome for the revision of the EU ETS, indeed.
Absolutely, and just looking at the another key policy initiative, Marianne, which is the Single European Sky and the revision of that. Are these exciting times for the Single European Sky? Can we see a further step of implementation? And what are the endeavoured results that Europe, the European aviation sector, will get out of this revision of SES, which you work so closely on?
So Single European Sky, it was delayed, as you know, for years and years. And in my opinion, it was not the main reason. It was not the Gibraltar airport, but the opposition of some participants in this industry of member states. But the idea came from the service providers. Now, after the study, new architecture of the airspace, and the report of the Wise Persons Group, the situation changed a little bit. The proposal, I think, is good. It's insisting so it's emphasizing again the things that are already in place, in power. I'm speaking about more powers for network manager that are implemented through implementing act in power since 1st of January this year, and also the activity of the performance review body, that it's also included in an implementing act. But I think the following: it doesn't matter the crisis. This is the future of aviation. So this is one step that should be done to go to arrive to the digital management of traffic management. So we have to do it, and we have to come very quickly with this proposal. There will be, of course, tough discussions, because the unions are not sleeping, and they are going around and speaking about the only thing that they know. Since 20 years, we are hearing the same thing: loss of jobs. Yes, but they do not know how and how many will be. They speak only like this. I don't think that it will be a big case, but anyway, this is the way to go. There is no other direction. And if we are discussing about emissions, yes, could be it will be a reduction of emissions from I don't know 6 to 10%, depending on the traffic. And this it was seen already, because in the absence of a lot of flights, the flights were very direct. Yeah, Eurocontrol has these statistics, and so the emissions were reduced, and so this is a good example. So as I said, there will be some discussions, but I hope that after 20 years we shall succeed to go on with this file.
Absolutely. And one of the other methods alongside the single European sky that we could see are green incentive schemes. And Hannah Burrows asks, if airlines need to see green incentive schemes in order to meet industry decarbonisation targets, what form could they take? Michael, I don't know if you have any initial thoughts about what forms those green incentive schemes could take for airlines in the EU, but also further afield.
Well, I think there's a number of asks for governments from the industry when we're looking towards the long-term objectives, and obviously regulation is one part of it. But what I would say is it really has to be around the two main areas: research and development into new aircraft technology, whether that's evolutionary design, whether that's looking into the prospects for battery or hydrogen-powered aircraft, or whether it's these radical new aircraft designs that we see, in which I do believe we're going to see flying in our skies in our lifetimes. We just don't know exactly what those aircraft are going to look like. It needs massive investment into the R&D. Now, the manufacturers are doing it from their side. As a manufacturing sector, we invest massively every year in research and development, but it needs similar support coming from government. The other side to it is sustainable aviation fuel, and we've only really touched on the regulatory side of it. But SAF, the problem that, as we all know, with SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, is cost. We can't produce it at scale yet because there hasn't been sufficient demand. There's not sufficient demand because it's too expensive, and round we go in this sort of vicious circle. What I believe is that at the moment where national governments are looking at ways to regenerate their national economies generally, not just their aviation sector, but the economy generally, there is, I think, huge potential for creating win-win situations if governments choose to put public money into the development of SAF projects. Now, whether that's conversion or construction of new production facilities, whether that's financial incentives to the producers or to the airlines in order to try and make the financial economic model work. There are different ways of doing it, but I think now is a key time where governments can put public money into SAF projects. The other really important aspect of this is that we've set these 2050 goals, whether you look at the broader industry objective under ATAG, or whether you look at the announcement for the EU Pact from the European stakeholders yesterday. We're looking at 2050, but make no mistake, it's not like we're going to get to 2045, 2046, 2047 and turn on a switch and all of a sudden we'll have reached these long-term goals. It's the policy decisions, it's the investment decisions that will be made probably in the next decade, to be honest. You know, I honestly think that by the end of this decade, we'll be able to be in a position to know whether we're going to make the 2050 objective. I don't want to be in a situation where we're looking at 2050 and in 10 years from now saying, actually, we're just not going to do it. So it's the decisions that are going to be made in the next 10 years, which will determine whether or not we make those long-term objectives.
Well, absolutely, and it's the investment decisions of today which will have impact for many decades. Absolutely, and Martina, I think it would be wrong of us to have a discussion about anything to do with the EU and the future relationship between industry and the environment without discussing Brexit. Now, how would you evaluate any potential risks with future deregulation on the UK sides from EU standards? Or would you say that there will be a future relationship with the UK CAA in which actually things won't change all that much?
Well, we don't know what the future holds in terms of Brexit. Negotiations are still ongoing. But what I think is just because the UK is leaving the EU doesn't necessarily mean lower environmental standards or sustainability standards, particularly when it comes to the aviation industry. This year, the UK industry has published the Sustainable Aviation Roadmap, by which by 2050, they're going to achieve net zero flights also in the UK. So I think that's quite promising from the UK side. I don't think it necessarily means that they will lower the standards here, or at least that the industry will seek for lower standards.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, the time has absolutely flown by. That is all we have time for today in terms of our discussion. First of all, I would like to say an enormous thank you to Marian-Marinescu, Michael Gill and Martina De Palma. This really is an absolutely critical time in the future of sustainable aviation in the context of COVID-19, but also a commission that have got these hugely expansive environmental policies. So to have your expertise has been absolutely invaluable to all those watching. I'd also like to personally say a big thank you to Josh Dell and Chris Martin for helping organise today's session. Thank you all very much and have a fantastic day.
Thank you, George. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Thank you.